I think the IP environment in China is generally misunderstood, such that there are a lot of people who are quite biased against IP in China. That is the enforcement of intellectual property rights, the securing of intellectual property rights. And I think this might have been fair had this comment been made 8 years ago, 10 years ago, but times have changed. China is now looking to reform its economy such that now they are looking to move from a manufacturing-based economy to a consumption-based economy. And a consumption-based economy is based on intellectual property. Without strong intellectual property rights, you will not be able to generate or create a consumption-based or a knowledge-based economy. That said, China is very keen to develop its own high-tech industries, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, media, and all of these types of industries require a very robust intellectual property system. That said, if you look at the IP environment now in China, it is very predictable, such that the laws are, I think, very strong in terms of for the protection of intellectual property. The enforcement of intellectual property is much more efficient now and streamlined, with a lot of government agencies having created intergovernmental relationships strictly for the purposes of enforcing intellectual property rights. And if you look at the court systems, for example, there are actually special intellectual property courts that are created solely for one reason: to protect intellectual property rights. And these courts are arguably the most sophisticated and best trained courts in China. Looking at this in its entirety, I think that when people are critical of the Chinese intellectual property system, I do not think that they are looking at China current day in terms of what resources are committed to the enforcement of intellectual property rights and the incentives that the government provides to Chinese companies for the creation of intellectual property rights. And when you take this all together, if a Canadian company does not understand this, they will not approach the business environment with the proper mindset, and that is they have to secure their intellectual property rights coming into China. And I would even advise before coming to China, because once you come to China, you have to have your intellectual property rights in place to be able to hit the ground running in China with your business plans. So looking at the environment now, I think that we can look at a case and with some certainty predict the outcome, in that if you have a very strong body of evidence, you have a sympathetic client, and the infringement is obvious on its face, the outcome is, for the most part, easy to predict. Whereas going back 8 years ago, we could have the same body of evidence, the same sympathetic client, and the same obvious infringement, and yet it would be very difficult for us to say that we're going to prevail in this case. But in looking at the IP environment now, it has improved considerably from 8 years ago. I would say it's another world, and I am very confident in the system. I believe in the system, and it is important also to bear in mind why these improvements are taking place. They're not taking place for the purposes of protecting intellectual property that is owned by foreign companies. The improvement in the IP environment in China is directed towards one thing, and that is really facilitating China's transition from a manufacturing-based economy to a consumption-based economy. When we look at a consumption-based economy in China, it is based on essentially intellectual property. You look at mobile phones, there are patents involved, designs, trademarks. When you look at designer brands, these are all items or property that increases the value of your products. And China cannot continue its growth at this scale for a country of this size, for a population this size, based on manufacturing, because this is low margin, low paying jobs that provide for very little taxes. China is aiming higher than that. I'd say much higher. They want to compete with all the giants in the world of technology, brands, media. At this time, China is the second largest market for movies in the world. And this opens up a whole new avenue for media companies in China. And looking at these type of industries, technology, pharmaceuticals, media, brands, this is all based on intellectual property. And if you do not have a strong intellectual property based system in China, you will not develop these industries because everybody will pirate your movies, everybody will copy your software, everybody will counterfeit your brands. And that is not in China's future interest. The Chinese government knows that in order for this country to make that next step, it needs a very strong intellectual property enforcement regime, and they've committed the time and the resources to developing their judges, their courts, their administrative enforcement agencies, and most importantly, their laws. Unfortunately, the intellectual property enforcement environment has not been consistently developed across the country, and this is for a number of reasons. Mainly, intellectual property is typically associated with more high-tech industries, and you do not find these type of industries in smaller cities or less developed provinces. And you'll see, for example, media in Beijing, pharmaceuticals in Shanghai, telecommunications in Shenzhen, Guangdong province. It's these type of industries which are very, very IP intensive. That is, they need intellectual property to survive, to generate profit. Without intellectual property, these companies, these industries would not exist. So typically what we see is much more developed intellectual property enforcement and administrative agencies in these developed cities. Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen are what we call tier 1 cities in China, which are, they lead the country in terms of development, GDP, R&D. And in these areas, you'll find that intellectual property is very well protected and very well understood by the courts. However, if you move to a tier 3 city, a much smaller city where the economy might still be based on manufacturing, you will not see this focus on developing intellectual property enforcement in these jurisdictions, because there is less of a need for it. And if their resources are scarce, the local governments have to decide where are they going to commit the resources for training, for development. And that said, we find that as you move from very developed jurisdictions, again, the tier 1 cities, to the less developed cities, the tier 3 jurisdictions, you'll find that IP enforcement unfortunately becomes less predictable and less well managed.